one file that we may need to change inside this setup if we want to change the HTML for our website. For example, we can change the title at the top of the tabs by removing this, and let's change it to Chatbot Project. If we save, Vite will automatically refresh our page just like Live Server does. And if we open our website, you'll see that the title at the top changed. Let's go back. So the index.html contains the HTML code for this website. The next file in the setup is package-lock.json. As a review, package.json has a list of packages that we need to install to run this project. What package-lock.json does is it saves the version numbers of all the packages that we installed. So the next time we run npm install, this file makes sure that we get the same versions for all of these packages. Now, npm automatically updates package-lock.json, so we don't need to change this file. The next file in the setup is package.json, and this basically contains the list of packages that we need in our project, as well as some other information about our project. When we npm install a package, it will automatically update this list of packages, so we don't need to change this file. Next, we have the file readme.md. So this is just text. It provides more information about this project. And this is not code, this is just for informational purposes. So we don't need to change this file. Finally, vite.config.js configures Vite. Vite is the tool that we used to set up this project. Vite also helps us build the website. That means it takes all the JavaScript and CSS and then loads them into the HTML file. Vite also creates a server. A server puts our website at a URL. For example, here it put our website at the URL localhost 5173. So this lets us view the website in a web browser, like a real website. When we were building the chatbot project in the previous lessons, we used an extension called Live Server. Live Server automatically refreshes the website when we change some code. The Vite server also refreshes the website when we change some code. So the Vite server is actually a replacement for the Live server that we used earlier. So those are three main features of Vite, and you can see that it's really helpful for setting up and developing a React website. We'll go back to VS Code. So the Vite config.js file basically configures Vite. So this config file is good enough, so we don't need to change this file. And that's it. Now we understand all the files and folders in this React setup. As you can see, most of these files are just configuration files, and we don't need to change them. The only files we need to focus on and change are the HTML file and the files in the source folder, which is our CSS and JavaScript files. Now that we understand all the files and folders in this React setup, let's move our previous chatbot project into this setup. First, we can close the chatbot project folder for now, and let's actually remove the node modules folder that we created earlier for practice. So we'll delete this folder, and let's also delete the test folder that we created for practice, and also the package-lock.json and package.json. Next, let's go into the chatbot project folder, and we'll open the source folder. And we'll start with this file, app.jsx. So notice that in this file, we have a React component called app. And this component represents the entire application. Now, previously in chatbot.html, we also created an app component. So all we have to do is to replace this app component with our previous app component. So let's go to our code and we're going to open chatbot.html. And we're going to scroll down till we see the app component, which is down here. So we're going to select the app component and make sure you don't select the code down here. We just want to copy the component over. So we're going to copy this and then go back to app.jsx. And we're going to remove this app component. So we'll select it and remove it. And we're going to paste the app component from our previous project. And now we're going to scroll up and ESLint is going to tell us we have some errors here. So we'll go through these errors one by one. First, for this error, ESLint is going to tell us that React is not defined. Before, we loaded the React external library using a script tag, and this provided a variable called React. However, now that we're using Node.js, we usually don't use script tags to load the external libraries. Instead, we download these packages into Node modules and then load it from Node modules. With Node modules, we can use a JavaScript feature called modules to only load the parts of the external library that we need. So when using NPM, a best practice is to load external libraries from Node modules instead of using a script tag. To load an external library from Node modules, we use the word import. And then we tell the computer which external library or which package we want to load from by typing from and then the name of the package, like the string React. If we just type a name directly like this, and we don't start with // or /, this tells the computer to look inside Node modules for the React package. So it's going to look in here, and it's going to find the React package in here and load it from here. Also, when importing from Node modules, we don't have to import the entire React library. We can just import what we need. For example, here, we just import the use state feature from React. So now that we imported use state, we can just use this directly here instead of doing react.useState. So we can remove react dot and use useState directly. Next, these two lines import images that were used in the example website. So we're no longer using these images, so ESLint displays an error. To fix this, we can just remove these imports. Next, let's scroll down. And it's going to tell us that the components chat messages and chat input are missing, and they don't exist in this file. So let's actually just copy them over from chatbot.html. So we'll go back to the previous project. And in chatbot.html, we're going to scroll up. And above the app component, we're going to copy over all of our other components. So we're going to select all this code. And we're going to copy. And let's go back to app.jsx. And we'll scroll up. Above the app, we're going to paste all of the other components that we created. And now if we scroll down and look at our app component, you can see that there's no more errors because we moved these components into this file. So now we've moved the app component into this new React setup. After copying over all of our other components, we now have some more ESLint errors. So let's scroll up to the top and we'll fix these errors one by one. First, you might see an error here for the props. ESLint tells us that these props are missing props validations. Props validation was an older feature of React. Newer versions of React don't use this feature, so we can actually turn off this check in ESLint. To turn off a check in ESLint, we're going to go to the ESLint config.js file, and we're going to scroll down to the rules section here. A rule tells ESLint what to check for. At the bottom of this object, we're going to add the string react/prop-types, colon, and we'll set it to the string off and save. So this will turn off this particular rule or this particular check. And now if we go back to app.jsx, we no longer have those ESLint errors because we turned off the check. Next, remember that we're no longer using react.useState. We can just use useState directly. So we can remove react. Next, let's scroll down, and ESLint will tell us that chatbot does not exist in this file. So previously, we loaded the chatbot using a script tag. But remember, now that we're using npm, a best practice is to load the chatbot from Node modules. First, we need to download the chatbot into Node modules. To do that, we're going to install the package supersimpledev. Let's go back to the command line. And currently, it's running the Vite server. So we're going to stop the server by pressing Ctrl-C on Windows or Ctrl-C on Mac. Note that on Mac, it's Control-C, not Command-C. So this will stop the Vite server and bring us back to the command line. Usually, to exit something from the command line, we can press Control-C in both Windows and Mac. Next, we're going to npm install the package supersimpledev. So this package contains the chatbot code that we were using earlier. Let's press enter. It's going to install the supersimpledev package inside Node modules. And now to load it from Node modules, we're going to scroll up in our code, and at the top, we're going to import and type curly brackets. So we're going to import the chatbot object, and we're going to import it from a string, and we'll import it from the package supersimpledev. So this will load the supersimpledev package from inside Node modules and get the chatbot out of it. And now that we have this chatbot object, if we scroll down, we have access to it, so it's no longer giving us an error. Finally, we're going to scroll down to the chat messages component. And here, it's telling us that React does not exist. So just like with useState, we can import useRef and useEffect directly as well. So let's remove the React dot from here and remove React dot from here. And we're going to scroll up. And at the top, we're already importing from the React package. To import multiple things, we can just add a comma at the end and import useRef and add another comma and import useEffect. This gets these two features out of React, and now we can use them directly in our code. And now we've fixed all the ESLint errors in our app component. If you did the exercises in the previous lesson, you may have some more ESLint errors. So make sure you fix any other errors that you have. And finally, let's save this file. Next, we're going to look at the file main.jsx. So this code sets up React. It calls create root, gives it a container, and then renders the app component onto the website. If we open our chatbot.html and we scroll to the very bottom, you notice that we do the same thing. We call create root, give it a container, and then render the app onto the website. So main.jsx does the same thing as this code. It sets up React and displays the app onto the website. Now, instead of copying this code over to main.jsx, we're just going to use the code in this file because it basically does the same thing. It just uses an ID for the container instead of a class. The one other difference in this code is it wraps the app in a component called strict mode. Strict mode is a special component provided by React. Strict mode basically gives us some additional checks and warnings when developing our app. And that's it. We moved all of our JavaScript code into this new setup. Now let's open this app in our browser to see what it looks like. We'll go down to the command line and let's make sure we're running inside the chatbot project folder by typing pwd and press enter. So that looks good. And we're going to start the Vite server by typing npm run dev and press enter. And we'll open this URL in our browser. I already have it open, so I'll open my browser and refresh this page. And now the website displays our previous chatbot app. In the text box, if we type a message like hello and press send, it will display a response from the chatbot. However, obviously it doesn't look right. And that's because we haven't moved our CSS code and images over into the new setup. So we're going to do that next. Let's move our CSS code into this new React setup. We'll go back to VS Code and we're going to open chatbot.html. And we're going to go to the top of this file right here. So at the top, we have all of our CSS code. We're going to move the CSS code into app.css. So we'll select all of this CSS all the way to the bottom, and we're going to copy it and then open app.css. And we're going to remove this default CSS. So we'll remove this and then paste our CSS code and save. And now, how does this CSS code get loaded on the website? If we open app.jsx, notice at the top, we import /app.css. So / means the current folder. It means the folder that contains this file, which is the source folder. So it's going to start from source and look for a file called app.css, and it finds it here. And it will load all the CSS code in this file onto the website. So you might be wondering, how can we import a CSS file like this? Doesn't import only work for JavaScript files? So this is actually a feature of Vite. Vite lets us import any type of file, like a CSS file or even an image file. Depending on the type of file, it will behave differently. If we import a CSS file, Vite will load all the CSS code in this file and apply it to the website. So that's how this works. We use Vite to load the CSS code inside app.css. And this allows us to separate our CSS code into its own file to make our code more organized. Next, you'll also notice that in here, we have an index.css file. This CSS file is loaded by main.jsx here using this import. So why do we have two CSS files? A best practice is to split up our CSS into different files. all the CSS for the app component go inside the app.css file. All the CSS for the overall website should go inside index.css. If we open app.css and we scroll to the top, the body styles here are not related to the app component. This styles the overall website. So a best practice is to split up this code and move this into index.css. So we'll select this code and then cut and save. And then inside index.css, we're going to remove this default code and paste those body styles and save. If we go back to app.css, the rest of this code is related to the app component. So it makes sense to leave it in app.css. And now we moved all of our CSS into our new React setup. So let's open our project again in the browser to see what it looks like. And now it's looking pretty good. It's looking like our previous chatbot project. And we have the layout and styling that we need. The last thing we're missing here are the images. So we're going to move those next. Let's move the robot image and the user image into the new React setup. We'll go back to VS Code and we're going to scroll down and we're going to select the robot.png image. And we'll copy it by pressing Ctrl+C on Windows or Command+C on Mac. And let's scroll up. And we're going to put it inside the source/assets folder. So this is typically where we put our images. So let's click on this assets folder and we're going to paste the image by pressing Ctrl+V on Windows or Command+V on Mac. And now we have the robot image in our new setup. Let's do the same for the user image. So we'll go down and select user.png and we'll copy and then select the assets folder and we'll paste. And now we need to load these images into our app. Let's open app.jsx. And to load this image, we can actually just import it. So at the top, let's type import and we'll give this image a name like robot profile image. And we'll import it from a string and we're going to locate this image file. So inside here, we'll start by typing /, which means the current folder or the folder that contains app.jsx, which is the source folder. So we're going to start from the source folder and then we're going to go into the assets folder. So we'll type assets, and to go into this folder, we're going to type a /. And then we're going to look for the file robot.png. So we'll type robot.png. So this is a file path. It tells the computer how to locate this file. So also notice that in this import, we just gave it a name instead of using curly brackets. This is called a default export, and we'll review this later in the lesson. But for now, just remember that when we import an image, we just give it a name without curly brackets. Let's also load the user image. So we're going to import and give it a name, user profile image, and we'll import it from a string, and we're going to locate the user.png file. So we'll start from the current folder using /. We'll look for the assets folder and then / to go into this folder, and we'll look for the file user.png. So remember, this is a feature of Vite. Vite lets us import any type of file, including an image file. When we import an image like this, Vite gives us a file path to that image. So this contains a file path like this, and we can use this directly in an image's source attribute. So let's scroll down to the chat message component, and in here, we have our two image elements. So in the source attribute, instead of robot.png, we're going to give it those images that we imported by typing curly brackets. And here, for the robot, we'll insert the variable robot profile image. And we'll do the same thing for the user. We'll remove the source attribute and type curly brackets, and we'll insert the user profile image. So that's how we import images using Vite and use them. Now let's save, and we'll check our website. And now all of the images are loaded. So let's try adding a message to make sure this is working. We'll type the message hello and press send. And that's it. We finished moving our chatbot project into this new React setup. We'll go back to VS Code. And the big advantage of this setup is we can separate our code into different files instead of combining everything into one file like we had before. Right now, we already separated our code a bit. We separated the app component into app.jsx, and we separated the code that sets up React into main.jsx. Now, we're going to separate our code even more. So inside app.jsx, if we scroll to the top, notice that there's many other components in this file, like the chat input component. A best practice is to separate each component into its own file. This makes our code easier to work with because each file only focuses on one component. So let's separate the chat input component into its own file. First, we're going to go to the source folder and we're going to create a new folder in here to group our components together. So we'll click this folder and we're going to click this icon to create a new folder, and we'll name it components and press enter. And inside this components folder, we're going to create a new file for our chat input component. So in here, we'll click it and then click this icon to create a new file, and we'll give it the same name as the component. So we'll name it capital C chat, capital I input .jsx and press enter. And now we're going to move the chat input component into this file. So we'll open app.jsx and we'll select the code for chat input, which is down here. And we're going to cut and then open chat input.jsx. And in here, we'll paste. And we'll scroll up and we're going to fix these ESLint errors. We'll start with this one. useState currently doesn't exist in this file, so we need to import it again. Let's go back to app.jsx, and at the top, let's copy this import. So we'll select it and copy, and we'll go to the chat input file, and at the top of this, we're going to paste the import. Now that we imported the useState, we're able to use it, and there's no longer an error. Now, ESLint also tells us that we're not using useRef or useEffect in this file, so we can remove these. Next, we're going to scroll down in this file, and we'll see that the chatbot object doesn't exist anymore in this file. So again, we'll go back to app.jsx, and let's move this import. So we'll select it, and chatbot is not used anymore in this file. So this time, we're going to cut. And inside chat input, At the top, we're going to paste that import. And now we have access to the chatbot. The last error here is that the chat input component is not being used. To fix this, we need to review a feature of JavaScript called modules. By default, any variables or functions that we create in a file only exist in that file. So chat input only exists in this file. It cannot be used outside this file. This helps us avoid naming conflicts, because if we use the same variable name in different files, it won't cause an error. Now, if we want to use this variable outside of this file, we need to export it first. To do that, in front of this function, we can just type export. And now this error is gone, because ESLint assumes that we're going to use this component outside of this file. So now let's save. And to use chat input in another file, we need to import it. So we'll open app.jsx. And at the top, we're going to import and type curly brackets. And in here, we'll import the chat input component. And we'll import it from a string. And we're going to locate the chat input file. At the front, we'll type // to start in the current folder, which is the source folder. And then we're going to go to the components folder. And we'll type a / to go into this folder. And we'll locate the file chat input.jsx. By the way, when importing a JavaScript file or a JSX file, if we're using Vite, we don't have to add .js or .jsx at the end. Vite will actually add this automatically. So as a shortcut, we can remove this. Also, a common practice is to import from packages at the top, and then JavaScript files, and then other types of files. So now we learn how to create these imports ourselves using the JavaScript modules feature and the word export. And we can use chat input in this file. Next, let's move the rest of these components into separate files. First, we'll move the chat message component. In the components folder, we'll click it, and we'll click this icon to create a new file. And let's name it the same as the component, capital C chat, capital M message, .jsx, and press enter. And now we're going to move the code over. So we'll open app.jsx, and we'll select this component and cut. And then inside chat message.jsx, we're going to paste the component. And again, we'll scroll up and fix the ESLint errors. So first, it's telling us we're not using this component in this file. To fix this, at the front, we're going to export this component so it can be used in other files. If we scroll down, ESLint tells us that these images are missing. So we need to move those imports into this file. We'll go back to app.jsx, and at the top, we're going to select these two image imports, and we're going to cut. And inside chat message.jsx, we're going to scroll to the top and paste. Now, one thing we need to be careful about is that we may need to update these file paths. So now, this file is inside the components folder. That means / is going to start at the components folder. It's not going to be able to find the assets folder anymore. To fix this, at the front, we're going to use //. So just like in the command line, .. represents the outer folder. This means it's going to go out of this components folder and into the source folder. And then it's going to look for the assets folder. It's going to find it, and it will go into the assets folder and find robot.png. And we need to make the same change for the user image. At the front, we'll use ... to go out of the components folder into source, and then we can locate the assets folder. And now these imports will work correctly, and we finished moving the chat message component into its own file. Let's save, and we'll go back to app.jsx, and we'll move the chat messages component into its own file. Inside the components folder, we'll click it. We'll click this icon to create a new file, and let's name it the same as the component, capital C chat, capital M messages, .jsx, and press enter. We'll go back to app.jsx, and we'll select the code for this component, which is till here, and we're going to cut, and inside chat messages, we're going to paste. Let's scroll to the top, and this component needs useRef and useEffect. So let's move those imports into this file. We'll go to app.jsx. We'll select this import at the top and copy. And in chat messages, at the top, we're going to paste that import. And in this component, we do not use useState, so we can remove it. Let's scroll down. And in this component, we also use the chat message component. So let's import that. We'll scroll up, and at the top, we'll import curly brackets, the chat message component from a string, and we'll locate this file using /. So it starts in the current folder, which is the components folder, and we'll look for the file chat message. And remember, we don't have to add .jsx at the end. Vite can automatically add it. Finally, ESLint tells us this component is not used in this file, so we need to export it. However, we're going to do something different this time. Instead of typing export at the front of this function, we're going to scroll down to the bottom. And at the end, we're going to type export default, and then what we want to export, which is the chat messages component. As a review, this is called a default export. It's useful if we want to export one thing from a file. So now let's save. And to import this, we're going to go to app.jsx. And at the top, we're going to import. And for a default export, we can just type a name without curly brackets. So we can type chat messages. We'll import it from a string, and we'll type / to start in the current folder. So for this file, we're in the source folder, and then we're going to go into the components folder. Components / and locate chat messages. So this imports whatever the default export is from this file and names it chat messages. This feature is called a default export. When we import and we use curly brackets, like up here, this is called a named export. So some people like using default exports because it encourages each file to focus on one thing. However, it's up to you which style of export you want to use. You'll also find that some packages use named exports, while other packages use default exports. So this is just a review of JavaScript modules. If you want to learn about modules in more detail, you can check out my JavaScript full course in the video description. Next, let's fix these last few errors. So we're not using useRef or useEffect in this file anymore. So we can remove these. And finally, this app component is already in a file called app.jsx. So we can just leave it in this file. And usually we put the app component outside of the components folder because app represents the entire application. It's sort of the most outer component of our application. So it makes sense to put it in the outer folder. So now let's save this file and let's make sure that all these other files are saved. And now we'll open our website in the browser and try it out. And it looks pretty good. Let's refresh just to be safe. And we'll give it a try. We'll click this text box and type the message, hello, and press send. So it's working correctly, just like before. So we'll go back. And now we separated each component into its own file. And this makes our code easier to work with because each file only focuses on one component, and each file contains less code. The last thing we're going to do in this lesson is to separate the CSS into different files. So let's open app.css. And you'll notice that in here, it contains CSS for multiple components. So we're also going to separate the CSS so that each component has its own CSS file. For example, this CSS code is related to the chat input component. So we'll go to the components folder and click it. And we'll click up here to create a new file. And we're going to name it the same as the component, capital C chat, capital I input, .css, and press enter. And we'll move all the CSS related to the chat input component in here. So in app.css, we'll select this code for the send button, the chat input, and the chat input container. And we'll cut, and inside chat input.css, we're going to paste that code and save. And now to load this CSS code, we're going to open chatinput.jsx. And at the top, we're going to import a string and the CSS file we want to load, which is this one. So we'll type // to start in the current folder, which is components, and we'll load chat input.css and save. As a review, this is a feature of Vite. If we import a CSS file, it will load all the CSS in the file and apply it to the website. Next, let's go back to app.css. And these styles are for the app component. So it actually makes sense to leave them inside the app.css file. Below this, these styles are for the chat message component. So let's create a CSS file for the chat message component. We'll go into the components folder and click here to create a new file. And we'll name this chat message.css and press enter. And we'll go back to app.css. And we're going to select the styles for the chat message user, the chat message robot, the text, as well as the chat message profile. And cut. And then inside chatmessage.css, we're going to paste the CSS code and save. And we're going to load this by going into chatmessage.jsx. And at the top, we're going to import a string. And we'll import this file using dot slash chat message dot css and save. We'll go back to app.css. Finally, these styles are for the chat messages component. First, we'll create a CSS file for this component. So we'll click this folder and click here to create a new file, and we'll name it chat messages.css and press enter. And in app.css, we're going to select this code and cut. And in chat messages.css, we're going to paste and save. And we'll load this by opening chatmessages.jsx. And at the top, we will import a string, and we'll locate the file dot slash chat messages dot css and save. And finally, we'll go back to app.css and make sure that we save all of our files. Now let's open our website in the browser. And everything should look and work correctly. Let's go back to our code. And that's it. We split up our JavaScript and our CSS code into separate files. And now each component has its own JavaScript file and its own CSS file. This makes our code a lot easier to work with because each file is focused on only one component, and each file contains less code. In the next lesson, we'll use this new React setup to work on a bigger React project, which is an e-commerce website that has multiple pages and more advanced features. And that's the end of this lesson. In this lesson, we created a proper React setup using the command line, npm, and vite. We reviewed the command line, which lets us give commands to our computer. We reviewed npm, which helps us download and use external libraries or packages. We learned the create vite package, which helps us create a proper React setup. We moved our chatbot project into the new React setup. We learned how to use ESLint, which highlights problems in our JavaScript code. We reviewed JavaScript modules, which lets us separate our code into different files. And we separated each component in the chatbot project into its own JavaScript and CSS files. Thanks for watching so far. If you find this course valuable, you can support the channel by liking this video, leaving a comment, and subscribing. You can also check out the premium version of this course, where you'll get all the lessons ads-free, broken down into small videos, as well as additional lessons and more projects that are not in the public React course. Currently, the premium course contains 11 lessons, and I'll be adding more lessons in the future. You can also get a certificate of completion, create comments or questions on specific topics, get progress tracking, search, and course notes. You can also check out the membership, where you can get this course ads-free, separated by each lesson, AI videos, backend tutorials, and more. Thanks again, and let's continue with the course. Here are some exercises to help you practice what we learned in this lesson. In this lesson, we're going to start a bigger project using React, and we'll learn an important feature called routing. By the way, if something in this lesson does not work for you, you can check the troubleshooting guide in the description. First, let's take a look at the project we're going to build. In our browser, we're going to create a new tab, and at the top, we're going to go to supersimple.dev/projects/e-commerce. And we can close these other tabs. This is an e-commerce project or an online shopping project. We can add products to our cart, and then we can click here to view our cart. And this page will display all the products in our cart. It will calculate the total for our order, and it will also calculate a delivery date. And then we can create an order. And this page will list all of the orders that we created. We can also click this button to track the order. So depending on the delivery date, it will show you the progress of the delivery. And we'll click here to go back to the orders page. So notice that this project has multiple pages, so it's much bigger than the chatbot project. And we're working with more data than before. So we have products, we have a cart, and we have orders. By the way, if you ever need to reset the cart or the orders, you can click this reset button here in the bottom right, and it will reset everything back to the default data. So let's click the top left to go back to the main page. And now that we introduced the project, we're going to build this with React. We'll go back to VS Code, and we'll collapse the chatbot project folder. And before we create a new React project, let's group these older files into a folder. We'll click this HTML file, and we'll create a folder. And let's name it React-Basics. And we're going to move all these files into this folder. Now, a shortcut here is to click this file, and then press Shift on your keyboard and click the bottom file. And it will select all the files between those two. And we can drag this into the folder. And we'll collapse it. So that just helps us stay a little more organized. Next, we're going to set up a new React project using Vite. To do that, we're going to go to our terminal. If you have the Vite server running, you can close it by pressing Ctrl-C on Windows or Ctrl-C on Mac. So if you're continuing from the previous lesson, the terminal should be running inside the chatbot project folder. To confirm that, we can run print working directory or pwd, and it will tell us that we're inside the chatbot project folder. Now, to set up a new React project, we want to be inside the React-course folder. So to get out of the chatbot project folder, we can run the command cd ... And if we press pwd, we should be inside the React-course folder. Another way to do this is to just start a new terminal. Now we'll use Vite again to set up a new React project. In the command line, we'll run the command npx create-vite, and we'll type @ and give it a version. So you can find the version in the description by clicking this link and going to lesson 6, and you'll find the version of Vite that we're going to use, as well as the full command. By the way, the version that you see in this video might be different than the version you see on your page. You should always use the version that you see on your page. I did this because it's hard to update the video. So this lets me easily update the version in the future. So select the version on your page, copy. So I'm going to paste the version here and press enter. For the project name, let's name it e-commerce-project. Press enter. And from this list, we'll press the down arrow and select React. And from this list, we'll press down and select JavaScript. And it will set up a new React project inside our React-course folder, which we see right here. And now we need to go into this folder using the command cd ecommerce-project. And we're going to run npm install to install all of the packages inside package.json. So we'll run npm install. Once we have everything installed, we can run this project using the command npm run dev. And now we can open this project using this URL in the browser. So we'll select this URL and copy. And in the browser, we're going to create a new tab. And then here, we'll paste. And now we have a new React project. Before we start updating the code, we're actually going to review a tool called Git. Git helps us track changes in our code, and it's useful in bigger projects because we're going to be making lots of changes, and it's easy to forget what we changed. So Git will help us track our changes. We're going to go to our code, and we're going to open the Git section here. If you already have Git installed, it should say initialize repository. If you do not have Git installed, you can click this link in the description, go to lesson 6, and follow these instructions to install Git. Once you have Git installed, we'll click initialize repository. Now, a repository is just a folder where Git is tracking changes. At first, Git will tell us that all of these files, or everything inside our React-course folder, is new. And that's because a repository starts out as empty. So Git considers all of these files as new files. We'll go back to the Git section, and we'll scroll up, and we're going to save all of these files into Git. At the top, we'll type a message to describe our changes. So let's type the message, add the starting files, and press commit. Commit means we're going to save these changes into Git. Now, you might run into an error when using Git, and it tells you have to configure your username and email. To do that, you can run these two commands in the command line and choose your username and choose the email you want to use. And try to commit again. And now it should work. If it asks to confirm, you can press yes. And now Git will start tracking any new changes that we make. For example, if we go into our code and open the e-commerce project and change some of these files, we type test and save. And in the source app.jsx, we type test and save. And then we can go to the Git section. And now Git will tell us everything that we changed in these two files. So as you can see, Git helps us track changes in our code. Also, Git lets us undo our changes. So to undo this change, we can click this arrow button here. And to undo all of our changes, at the top, we can click this arrow button here. So that's a review of how Git works. It can track our changes, and it lets us easily undo our changes. Let's go back to our files. And remember that in our React setup, we have a file called .gitignore. So now we can learn what this file does. .gitignore tells Git which files and folders to ignore, or not to track changes. For example, in this file, we can see the folder node modules. So this tells Git that if there are any changes inside node modules, it will not be tracked. The reason we ignore node modules is because this folder is very large, and none of the changes inside this folder are changes that we make. Instead, we generate this folder using a package.json and npm install. So because this folder is generated, it doesn't make a lot of sense to save this in Git. So that's a review of Git. Git helps us track changes in our code, and .gitignore tells Git which files and folders to ignore or to not track changes. Now we're ready to start the project. First, we're actually going to download the HTML and CSS for this project. We'll click this link in the description and then click here, and this will open GitHub. And this contains all the HTML and CSS for the e-commerce project. The reason we're going to use some starting code is because this course is focused on React. By using this code, we can focus on learning React features rather than spending our time writing HTML and CSS. If you want to practice HTML and CSS, you can try to recreate the design on your own after this course. Another reason we're using some starting code is in the real world, we often work on an existing project rather than a new project. So this will give us some practice working on an existing project. So to download the starting code, we're going to click this code button here, and we'll click download zip. And we'll open our downloads folder. For me, it's here, and we're going to unzip this file. On Windows, we're going to right click and click extract all and extract. And on Mac, you can just double click the zip file. And then we're going to open this folder, and we're going to move all of these files and folders into VS Code.